All right, so this is the picture that we use quite often. That's the demo, that's the anatomy of the face. And here is the picture that we use even more often, right? So you see, this is the highlight, which gives the focus on the nuchal ligament and the total head position. So what's the key perspective? The key perspective we discussed in detail in webinar number 3, right? So you see that was the head spiralization. And I think somewhere earlier this year in one of the question and answers, I actually kind of talked more about the head twist, this kind of the shrimp thing. So, but fundamental point is this: what we should start doing, what is the key change of reference for us? So instead of this kind of standard images which we have with the straight lines and planes, which really create nothing but confusion, we have to go back to the understanding that the system is dynamic, so that we are dealing always with the angular velocities and angular accelerations and the related terms. So that's the key point. So when you look at the head, what you should be seeing there, you should be seeing the turn of the head. So you should be seeing the spiral, this spiral, right? And now you see, pay attention to the fact that I'm drawing the spiral outwards, so from the link at the ear, right? So you see, and then of course I should draw that spiral inwards as it closes in. So these are the kind of, whether it's locking the head or whether it's, like whether it's the tone and tension control that kind of diverges from the inner ear outwards, or whether it's the one that converges from the back to the front, right? So you see, in other words, if you think about the fascia curtains of sorts, right? So you see the one that goes from the back to the front and kind of ties at the ears, or the one that actually goes from the front to the back and then, stems and goes all the way through the back. This is what you should see here. Two lines, but both of them represent, I'm just going to do it out of this kind of ease of drawing, they represent the spiral, right? So you see, like, think about as the fetal position, right? So you see the fetal turn. So it's the map, that fetal map that is always with us, right? And what happens through the early development are all of those arches, which are like initially the gills, like fish gills, right? And then they form, and also, again, I always remind this thing, the jaw connection, the ear starts low, right? So you see the human ear travels up high into this position. So the travel of the ear between the jaws, it's effectively like this kind of zipping this connection, zipping the connection between the jaw and the head. So which defines the posterior and anterior part in that respect, right? Or it defines that closure. So what we see as a straight line is not really a straight line. That's a line which matches the jaw that has traveled through. right? So you see effectively it's one curve and the other curve that arrived, and then made a kind of a zipper out of them. But the fact that they have the common zipper from the front and from the back, you know, doesn't make it straight. So, you know, if you put one kind of gear wheel that goes like this and the other gear wheel that goes like this, so even if they meet each other, it doesn't mean that they suddenly become straight, right? So you see, they're still working as the gear wheels. They still provide those kind of those teeth. So that's a critical thing to understand, that, you know, why this is such a common problem. It's such a common problem because we all, one way or another, are underlocked. We are not fully turned and locked in. And when the system doesn't work through this lock, right? So you see ventral to dorsal and dorsal to ventral, then we end up with some type of issues, right? So you see, if your closure is not sufficient, so instead of locking in, instead of operating via, if we use the familiar terms, the head flexion, then the other mechanism kicks in. So you try to stabilize it via the use of the head extension, right? But the head extension is based here in the neck. So it's a lift of the head instead of the closure of the head, right? So that's a big difference, lifting the head backwards and keeping it there, because that opens the, you know, then you are having your pivoting action not in the middle, but it shifts into the neck. So now you start having, instead of the thing which had a kind of pivot in the middle and was closing forwards, now you have the thing which is shifted backwards over here, and it opens backwards. So what would happen as a result when the head starts tilting back? The jaw starts drifting forwards. You know, if you tilt, if the head starts tilting back, the tension which is necessary to control this entire area comes with the jaw shifting forwards. Or that's where the jaw protracts, right? So you see, that's a protraction of the jaw. Or, of course, another version is when the jaw retracts, so effectively fuses with the neck closes, so the head then moves as a single unit, tilting backwards. So it either protracts or retracts. That's it. But the fact is that in both of those scenarios, the jaw is then no longer having that freedom. So it's no longer being just that lock of the jaw. Now, instead of kind of going through the zipper, it actually starts activating the temporomandibular joint, which rotates, and it rotates uneven. And the moment you have that trying to regulate it by rotating your jaw over this pivot, you have a problem. Let me redraw this. You see, if your jaw starts moving and it starts having the pivot over here in the temporomandibular joint, you are already in trouble, because then the temporomandibular joint is going to, because it's rotating over that pivot and it travels this kind of path, right? So you see, when you start the movement, first it stays and then it travels forwards, right? So you see the jaw travels forwards when you open your jaw. When you open your mouth, the jaw has this kind of first, then first it kind of the first part, nothing happens. The micro movement which you saw there, the slightly open mouth with the tongue sticking out. But the moment you open it more, that's it, the jaw rotates. If the jaw rotates and you need this jaw rotation as the way of regulating your rotation at the neck, right? So you see then those two start kind of competing with each other. Then, of course, you are going to have a problem in the middle. So, in other words, it's important the moment you start using the jaw activity to calibrate the situation, you are already very much trapped in this scenario that you are going to have the incomplete discharge of the masseter muscle. Why is that? Let's then zoom in. Okay, so here we are. All right, so you see this is a demo. So Ken Hub as always. So you see here two parts, right? And this is actually a good illustration which shows you two things, right? So you see that it shows you both the lower part and the upper part, right? So you see this part that travels all the way into the temple, but it's related to the jaw, right? And this is the part which is attached to the zygomatic. And now this is the temporomandibular joint. So you see, as I said, if we look at the jaw movement along this line, right? And again, the pivot is here, so the jaw doesn't move down. It moves around this arc, right? So you see, that's very clear. That the jaw moves, the jaw moves around this arc. So when the jaw moves around this arc, of course, it's more going downwards there. This is it. You know, the way how the temporomandibular joint is structured, as you can see, it's not just a pivot, it's a pivot and the shift. So, and because it's a pivot and the shift, that's why it's so difficult to calibrate. So when you open the jaw, it travels forwards. When you bite, you use this contraction. But the contraction happens in the other direction compared to the jaw opening. So as a result, if there is tension that accumulates in this area, your first attempt to deal with it would be to try to open the jaw. But opening the jaw is not such a controllable thing, because, you know, the only thing where it's more or less controllable is when you yawn, right? But when you yawn, you also connect your entire neck. This type of thing. So yawn is a more productive calibration. But then when you are asleep, then it's the next thing, right? So you see, then it's the masseter itself, which also gets trapped between these two sort of competing lines, the one that goes towards the temple and the one that connects towards the jaw. So there is this tension that accumulates around. So you just cannot fully discharge the residual tension. But the residual tension here is formed so much exactly because of the path of the jaw opening, right? So you see here, it shows you this type of the opening jaw, but let's kind of put the mechanics of TMJ opening. See, simple rotation of the mandibular condyle accounts for the first 25 millimeters. Further opening is due to the forward gliding of the condyle that goes forward. So let's see what we have as the demonstration here. Okay, so you see here, right? So this is the jaw, and these are the keywords: roll and slide. So if you open your jaw, first it rolls and then it slides. And it's the reason why it's kind of difficult to discharge and why it's happening so much with the, bruxism, with that difficulties to discharge masseter, is because that's the nature of the temporomandibular joint, that it has the roll and slide. So it has two directions, and therefore, as it has two directions, it's also the part that it has, you see, that's one line of explanation, right? So you see which has to come with the masseter, but this is a better picture which shows you that the masseter and the temporalis, they're very much overlapping each other, right? And again, if you look at your own kids, you're going to see that with them, the involvement of the temporalis is usually much higher or much lower than in a healthy person. So you see, like in a healthy person, it in being involved, like when you do any kind of chewing motion, you will see a lot of this, a lot of, you'll feel a lot of action of the temporalis. So what happens? Either your child is going to use very little of it, so it's going to be much less of the temporalis engagement, or if the child, especially kind of microcephalus and so on, then you might get a dominating, like really when the child is chewing, there would be massive kind of chunks of the temporalis moving underneath. But the fact is that marrying these two different layouts of the temporalis and the masseter, which blend together into a single jaw, would be very difficult, especially when you kind of get this roll and slide kind of positioning of the action of the temporomandibular joint. So that's why, speaking of the roll and slide, right? So even if you think, of the elbow, you can say that it's simpler in terms of that it just has the roll with almost without the slide, right? You think about the hip, it's a roll without this additional slide. So sure, the blade might have a certain slide, but we are not really welcoming that, right? So you see, sliding actions are more difficult to control than the rolling action, because in fact, sliding is the extension of rolling. But that's the nature of the thing. So fundamentally, this is what we face, especially if the person has less of the temporalis engagement. That means that their overall chain is also shorter. So that means that when they chew a lot more with the actual masseter, and they chew a lot more, so they actually do a lot more via the temporomandibular joint, or when, if they don't chew, right? So because don't forget that a lot of bruxism comes in the kids who do not chew. So I'm just trying to lump it all together, but the reality is that this is more a type of the scenario when the person actively uses the temporomandibular joint for closing the jaw, for chewing, and so on. But the more typical scenario which occurs for the children in our scenarios is the one which is related to the troubles which occur lower. So to the troubles which occur at the transition, wait a second, which occur at the transitions which go from the lower parts. So you see, we always talk about the fact that if the head flexion is not working and the person has to regulate the head via the head extension, the jaw gets ejected. So, and then the entire set of the muscles, which are the mouth floor muscles and the everything which is linked to the hyoid, these are the ones which are becoming the primary kind of regulators. So again, we discussed this many times. So when you look at the connections at the bottom, so we have to keep in mind this idea, right? Is that if the neck itself is participating in the head extension regulation instead of the head flexion, if the precision of the nuchal ligament is poor, if the stability of the head is poor, then what happens? Then we are in the scenario when the person needs to use their direct connections to the head as a part of the stabilizing thing. So that's kind of the number one simple reasoning. And if we go here, we have a number of the great illustrations for the so-called digastric triangle. That's the demonstration of this digastric triangle. See, what are you observing here? You are observing the familiar things. You're observing the triangles which have this portion, but it also has the SCM and it also has the trapezius. So we always have to remember that what is the key problem of the child with the CP? Head control is not done, which consists of the neck control plus other controls, right? So you see jaw control plus arms control, right? So what is the main problem? The main problem that the true neck control is almost absent. So if normally this is 99% of the head control via the actual neck, right? If this is missing, then the brain recruits the second best connections. And the second best connections are the ones which link directly to the head. So that's the SCM, which connects the clavicle directly to the head, right? And this is the trapezius, which connects the shoulder blade directly to the head. So the arms helping the head. And the other available part, that's the jaw. So we just have seen in the previous picture that those muscles, right? So the digastric muscles, they connect to the head. So we have three of these big options of connecting to the head. And if the neck is not working properly, then the brain will recruit these options. So that's a more frequent scenario for the children who are more severe, to have the more open mouth, right? Open mouth, the jaw dropping and so on. So in their scenario, that will be kind of a different mechanism. It's not will be so much through the chewing, it will be more through this continuous activation, which tries to kind of help with the head control. So that's really the key understanding. And if I look here, so you see that's a great picture which could be seen, right? So you see this great picture gives you that image So this shows you the digastric muscles. See this blue and the green one, so which is kind of linked around like this, but it's part of the so-called suprahyoid or the mouth floor package, right? So you see why we're concentrating on the digastric, because digastric is the one that clearly shows the connection to the head. So this is the SCM, this is the digastric, so this is the connection of the head. So of course, if the person needs to use the jaw as the way to help with the head control, then if we, oh, you see that's a great image as well, right? So you see for the combination of triangles there, then as we have seen here, or here, or here with the temporomandibular joints, yeah, you see the guy opens the jaw, right? So you see that's where you see this slide forward. So that means that when your jaw is being recruited for the connections at the head, so as this set, then what happens to the temporomandibular joint? Temporomandibular joint is obviously being secondary, right? So you see, it's not the jaw which opens and kind of discharges. It's the jaw which continuously being in tension when you use the jaw the same way as the child uses the arms to create this different tensions in order to control the head. So the same way, I know there is all kind of variations of using the jaw to control the head. And of course, that means that the temporomandibular joint itself is going to be under the secondary involvement there. It will not be kind of closing and opening and so on. It would be, you know, going through this roll and slide or whatever, more slide than roll or whatever combinations, and the additional tension lines as the ones, you know, so all the tension lines that go through it, that go up either to the temporalis or the masseter itself, so they are also going to be engaged, but not via the front, but more via the back. So what happens? You know, exactly the thing. When the child is active during the day, he is busy with trying to calibrate the head position via the use of the jaw. Finally, when the child goes to sleep, the same way. As you can see, two types of the scenarios, right? So there are kids who move a lot in their sleep, discharging their legs, right? And there are kids who actually like pull their legs or whatever, so the peripheral muscles very tightly as a kind of transitional way to the discharge. So that's exactly the same thing which happens here through this region. So that's the key understanding. And that's why if we look at this picture here, so that's a very, very good, you know, illustration as well, right? Because this illustration itself shows us the potential conflict between the masseter and the temporalis. And that's what the person is trying to do. So you see, that's what the person is trying to do by doing all this kind of moves. So trying to find the way which is going to discharge those conflicts and the, you know, which goes over the TMJ and towards the temple and so on. Now, what do we have? Two things. If we move to the practical aspects. As we move to the practical aspects, part of it is going to be very, very simple and saying, okay, you know what? This is our kind of number one principle to begin with, is what you see is what you work at, right? So you see, if you have the tension, then you definitely highlight the fact that, okay, we need to help the child to get this discharge. So in other words, there's a lot of tension that accumulates, but we also understand that it's not just the masseter, it's also the temporalis, right? So you see, from that perspective, you know, as you saw in that recommendation earlier about doing the massage, so what we want to do, we just want to do it on a more practical and more kind of precise way, right? So, but that's exactly what we are looking at here. We're identifying the areas of the greatest tension and then start using the proper techniques there, right? So you see, because here we have the viscoelastic interfaces, right? So you see, we can have different types of the, you know, variations of the cigar rolling technique, variations of the slide techniques, and variations, of course, of the good old, you know, oscillating techniques with the super X, because that gives us also, you know, the use of the super X gives us a lot of the benefits there. So it's the distribution on the one hand, on the other hand, it's not kind of troubled, you know, it's not uncomfortable. And of course, here, that's also the reason why, you know, the smaller Vibra tools, whether it's the, you know, the Vibra kind of mini massager, or whether it's the Vibra even like toothbrush and so on, so that could be helpful. But in the long run, you know, as the experience shows, we can actually work with the even mini Vibra gun in that area. But the key point when it comes to our work there, right? So fortunately, we are not only doing the discharge, but we are also enriching the quality of this underlying fascial bed, which then facilitates the improved distribution through the muscle. So that's the plus. So yes, we handle the immediate discharge on the one hand, but on the other hand, as we handle the discharge, we also get the deeper underlying connections as well. That's one thing. The second thing is that we have to look at the bigger context, right? Of course, we see a concentration of loads that go into the masseter and the temporalis as the immediate cause of the bruxism, as they discharge over the temporomandibular joint. But then what do we have? We have the next thing. The next thing is, of course, looking at the total facial thing, getting everything back from the skin level, right? So we will always keep coming back. This is where we are looking at strolling under the skin and the relationship between the skin, fat, and the muscles, right? So where we go back to the usual story that the main distributive mechanism for the muscles of the face would be through their connections to the skin, right? So that's why, you know, we just get back to the same key principle. The central trouble of the problem, like bruxism, is accumulated concentration, simplification. So the pathways through which the loading and unloading is happening, they become too localized, you know, too simplified, too, you know, not distributed enough. So on the one hand, we want to help on a daily basis with the improve discharge, but on the other hand, we want to contribute towards the increased distribution. And when we talk about the increased distribution, of course, we then start looking at what are the classes of neighbors. So speaking of the classes of neighbors, then we start talking about the circular arrangement of the facial muscles, right? And of course, skin-fat interaction. So that means that on the one hand, our good old friend, the fascia gel, generally, right, for overall enrichment of the facial mimics via the improved distribution at the skin-fat muscle level. On the other hand, we are looking specifically at the face and saying, oh, what can we do in order to enrich and facilitate those circular arrangements so that there would be better distribution. Even when the jaw moves in that kind of unfortunate fashion, that would be a greater contribution into it with the circles of the face rather than just single lines. So like, again, if you look from here, you have to see this, right? So you see from this perspective, you can see that those are not just lines, they are circles, right? So you see, if you look at the face, you should see it as this kind of mountain, right? As this sort of hill with its isolines. So where this line is the base. So the more distribution we bring through the face, the less would go into those preferred lines of the masseter and the temporalis as the immediate bruxism kind of executives. And then, of course, this is what goes with the face itself, but then we go into the big picture. The big picture is always with us. We need to put the true neck connections, so there will be more and more of the neck control in the head control, so that the neck, this secondary contributions of the digastric to the opening of the jaw and creating this kind of additional line from the jaw to the head would not be necessary. And of course, that also brings us to the idea of the improved distribution. So because again, what happens if you look at your child, you're going to see that very often you face this scenario with some very tight muscles, right? So you see like the gastric is very often is very, very tight. If you look under the jaw, it's not very well spread. The whole thing is narrow. And, like this line is just, like being very dominant. So what do we want? Of course, we want our usual thing, which would be improved distribution through the mouth floor. Even in the situation when the child is still using the head, still using the jaw as a supplementary for the head control, that we want to maximize the distribution through the mouth floor. So basically, that's the thing, right? I'm not saying that bruxism is easy, like easily solvable. No, but I want you to understand that it's very logical part of the whole thing, right? It belongs to the big picture of the ultimate development of the head into the complete locked head flexion with the corresponding evolution of the deep ligaments of the neck and the deep sensors at the base in the proper fashion. So that's the key. The rest, how do we discharge those areas which are overloaded, right? Which are, how do we discharge them? in a more ecological way the actual masseter and the temporalis, right? So then how do we link, how do we improve the distribution around the digastric? So you see, how do we improve the distribution amount of the mouth floor, of the neck, and so on. So, and then, of course, is the total face, the total distribution within the face itself. So the usual story, discharge on the one hand, where there is immediate problem, focusing on the weaknesses which are responsible for that overloading and the overuse of the troubled areas, right? And then looking at all other formats of the distribution in the region. So that's what we're looking at. And again, what would be the signs of progress? The signs of progress would be the improvements of the tone regulation, reduction of those kind of concentrations of the force lines into the strongest muscles, right? And then also, getting the additional variations of the face mimics, activities, and so on, because that is showing that there are good processes of the distribution repertoire and so on, which are emerging there, as opposed to what was the hyper concentration of forces before. So that's really kind of the principle. And as I said, I was very surprised that, the current state of Bruxism is really so much, very far from the representation at the local and, local, regional, right? The specific geographic and mechanical thing, and kind of escapes into the areas of, psychology and the general stress. And you see, like, if you are really honest about it, you can say, what, yes, we understand that we want to, by right, we should have given you here the format of this kind of explanation, with the mechanical executive. So if the door lock is broken, right? So you see, at first thing you do, you recognize, okay, so your problem is not the missing alarm, right? So you see, you might get the alarm, but it's a separate issue. But you're not trying to solve the broken lock in the door or distorted door frame by installing the alarm or changing the alarm settings, right? So if you can't fix the lock and the door, you say, okay, yeah, I understand that would have been the best solution. And currently we are trying, but so far we don't have the solution. So we can only give you this kind of, collateral option. At least that would have been fair and understandable, right? Because otherwise, you see, the whole thing is just being relegated to this kind of advice, do a little bit of massage, this, and so on and so forth. So, or of course, to the dental interventions, and partially also to people who do this kind of osteopathic moves, with the, or the chiropractic moves, so is it trying to fix the imbalances of the temporomandibular joint. But, I hope that has been clear, the scenario of the bigger picture. So that completes our Bruxism story. And of course, as always, we would be happy to hear your questions, right, for the future, and also feedback on these ones. And, so that you spread the word as much as you can, because there could be parents out there who are possibly stuck in this type of situation and don't know what to do. All right. So all the best. Cheers. Bye-bye.